Hello, my name is Juan Perez, and for my project, or in this case, I'm doing a slideshow. I'm talking about sexism and eroticism, specifically to do with Egyptian queens and their ties to Victorian ancient Egypt. So, why were the Egyptian queens interpreted as sexy or very eroticized is really the main question I'm going to be answering today, and how like their interpretation of British versus the reality of what the Queen's role actually was, and how I'm gonna use a certain queen that you could probably guess as an example of like British, again, British portrayal versus reality. And as you can see, my thesis here is the misinterpretation of Egyptian queens led to the downplay of female importance and sexualization of ancient Egyptian women. And you can definitely see the effects of this nowadays because, this image here is just I just Googled mummy, and this is there was like six images of just like sexy mummy costumes, and then I Googled sexy mummy, and then you have this very like I mean it's nice, but it's like a perverted artwork of a mummified queen. So yeah. So what stems of this prejudice against Egyptian queens, especially in media nowadays, but it stems from the Victorian British, and when they were discovering the tombs, they and interpreting hieroglyphs, they saw all this erotic nature that was associated with royalty and mostly to do with the queen. And since they didn't really understand, they just interpreted the queens to be like these really sexy and eroticized beings that also held a lot of power because they were the queen. And in reality, the queen was pretty important. I mean, she was the king's consort and of course the king's wife, so the queen had a lot of power, but British just interpreted queen as just this sexy lady who had a lot of power and didn't really do much, when in reality she did have quite a saying in laws and all that. And as you can see, I wrote here Victorian obsession with the erotic nature of the queen, an image that they had created for themselves. So for demonstration, I put queen has this put or fuck, I can't say her name, I'm sorry, but I put her next to the Tom Cruise movie, The Mummy, as an example of the reality of a queen who has a lot of power and isn't she tries to portray herself as more masculine to show that she can do what a man could do, or a normal king could do, even though she's a woman. And then I put it next to the Tom Cruise movie, where it's just a really good movie of, of a sexy Egyptian queen trying to get her revenge on people who looted her tomb. And that's a pretty common theme, as we'll see later on down the line. But yeah, I just thought this would be an interesting comparison to make. And then, so I used this because I thought it was a great quote from Brown, and it says a king's mother only assumed her status of on the ascension of her sons, and at times this meant that a previously non-royal lady could be elevated to the first lady position. The high status of the king's mother may be in part due to the status of mothers in general, but also undoubtedly rested on mythic counterparts. And the reason why I chose this quote is because it shows that like in times of crisis, a woman would ascend the throne, and the thing that comes to mind the most, like in comparison, is like Queen Elizabeth. Like, because usually most kingdoms are associated with the queen, but like Queen Elizabeth was the Queen of England for so long, and I think this is like a great way of saying it because like it didn't really matter if they were female or male. I mean, in Egyptian society, obviously there was like a preference of male, but it's like if a female needed to ascend the throne, like they could, and I just thought that was really interesting, and it ties into the fact that like oh sorry, it ties into the fact that women like could still hold power and they weren't like sexualized because of just because they were women, they were kind of sexualized because of like ritualistic stuff. And I don't know, I just thought that that was an interesting quote. And then what I think stems from like the scandalous nature of the Egyptian like interpretation of the British is because like as you can see, I said skimpiness and beauty of Egyptian mummies stems from Victorian England's writers' imaginations of exotic beauty. It was mostly from like reports and stories written by Victorian writers that just so happened to have, you know, female mummies who would enact their revenge on British men. And I think Jewel of the Seven Stars is like a great example of this, where Queen Dara, even though she's like really exotic, she has 7 fingers. She's been dead for so long. She looks different than British women, but at the same time, like similar in their like body and like nature. Like they still somehow found a way to like describe describe them and like sexualize them. And I took a quote here from when they enter the tomb and where like Treylani and um the main character like describe her body, and I thought it was super interesting. As you can see, I have the 7 hands here, where they said there was two, an added wonder that on this ancient hand there was no less than 7 fingers, the same, all being fine and long and of great beauty. Like it shows that the British were just so mesmerized by the exotic nature of Egyptian queens that like they would dramatize it and still romanticize it in a way that like would make it seem like a 3,000-year-old dead Egyptian woman would was just waiting to wake up in 20th century or late 19th century England and like just get fantasized about. I don't know. I thought that was pretty funny, but yeah. So I I looked up like some interpretations of the book, and I found that writer and critic William Wren wrote that if that romance is hard to swallow, the failing is less with Stoker than with the period in which he was living and writing. The view and portrayal of women can also be a challenge for a contemporary reader. It's puzzling how Victorians managed to write female characters that are strong while also at the same time weak and almost helpless. And I thought like this was like a perfect summary of the book because like Queen Tara is this figure who like curses people and she kills people, and but at the same time like she's she's just a very sexy 3,000-year-old woman who like falls to British ingenuity and like British intellect, but like at the same time like she's this powerful queen who's been dead for so long and has the ability to use these curses. And I just thought it was super interesting that William Wren thought it was just like, it's just outdated and it's just part of its time. That's just how the Victorians thought. And I just thought that was interesting because it's kind of like what I was thinking when I was reading the book. Like, would this book fly nowadays? Probably not. But I think it was a pretty interesting book, and I really like how he describes your he doesn't really describe it as eroticism, but it's like portrayal of he calls it the portrayal of women in romance, but it's like in the book it's very obvious he's talking about like the eroticism and like the sexism held against women, like just seen for their bodies and not really like for their power, like what else they did, just adjust their looks, and I just thought that was super interesting. So yeah, so my conclusion is that the culture sexism indeed was a part of ancient Egyptian society, where men were seen as a higher being than women. That could be seen where women could only really ascend the throne if like there was nobody really able to ascend it, like or no male was really able to ascend it, but like the the rituals that happened were misinterpreted by the British, and then they they just let their imaginations go wild and just like sexualized Egyptian women. And we can still see that today, as you can see with the amazing Tom Cruise movie. And then the other thing I wrote was the Victorian British were fascinated with the ancient Egyptian society, and they wrote about these people and their ways with British ideals. And I think that can be seen the most in Jewel with the Seven Stars because, you know, they try to solve this 3,000-year-old puzzle with again, British ingenuity, and they try to push like British ideals, like what would a British guy do to solve this? And you know, it's kind they kind of show like their downplayment of women, which is also like more of a British thing. It wasn't, I mean, it was present in ancient Egypt, obviously, but it's like it's more concentrated in this book because of British way of thinking, not exactly the ancient Egyptian way of thinking. And then this led them to fantasizing about the foreign and ancient women, which, as you can see from the first slide, is still prevalent today. So, yeah, anywho, that was it for me. These are my sources, and thank you for watching.